Though convicted felon Donald Trump has repeatedly ducked or canceled interviews in the aftermath of his debate, the media continues its disproportionate and irrational focus on President Biden's debate performance. And people are getting so annoyed that they're actually calling the media out, often to their faces. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to look at in this video, but I want to lead with this. In the aftermath of the first presidential debate between Biden and Trump, again, the knives have been out for President Biden, not just in right-wing media, but in mainstream media as well. They're ignoring the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States has effectively given the president of the United States, be it Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or anyone in the future, carte blanche to commit crimes with impunity. And it's gotten a fraction of the focus that, again, Biden's 90 minutes have, or the fact that Donald Trump lied 30 times, didn't answer any questions substantively or directly. It's the asymmetry, which Trump always benefits from. And yet we have found out that in the aftermath of that debate, Trump has repeatedly ducked or canceled interviews. And it makes you wonder, what does he have to hide? I want to play these clips and we'll unpack them together.
ABC News also offered a one-on-one interview to Donald Trump after the debate. He declined.
In fact, we wanted to hear more from Trump tonight. Our Mike Gooding was scheduled to interview the former president after the rally, but we heard just about 15 minutes ago the Trump team canceled on Mike Gooding after asking us what our questions would be for the former president, telling Mike that there was no more time and that the former president only wanted to talk about last night's debate.
So before we get into anything else, I think that's something worth noting. Donald Trump, who supposedly exudes this air of confidence and competence, according to his supporters, despite the fact that his administration accomplished objectively far less than the Biden administration, both executively and legislatively. It's interesting that he is ducking interviews, probably because he knows he can't do interviews without lying, and he may run into fact checking, and he can't substantively answer questions, something which is in stark contrast with President Biden for all his faults. And yet again, the media is not talking about this. But the asymmetry as a whole, people are starting to pick up on it, particularly on MSNBC and other left-wing media outlets. And I want to play you a couple of clips because not only is the media being called out on it, in some cases, the media is being called out on it to their faces. I want to play this first clip here of Amisha Cross on the Katie Fang show. And she's a Democratic strategist. And again, I just love how she phrases this. She just, no nonsense, calls out the asymmetry and the normalization of Trump, which makes the Democratic agenda that much harder to fulfill because they're held to different standards.
Why aren't there calls for Donald Trump to bow out of the race for president? He slept through his New York criminal trial. He can't read from a teleprompter. He babbles, makes up words, and he's a convicted felon.
Because people have normalized Trump's behavior. They have made it okay for Donald Trump to do anything and everything, and for it to be considered completely normal, completely rational, because Trump operates in that apparatus, and it has worked for him for years. Long before he became president, he was doing wild and crazy things, and throughout his duration as president, he also proceeded to do those same wild and crazy things, up to and including trying to turn our Constitution on its head, trying to, force people to shoot protesters in the streets when the BLM protesters were peacefully protesting in D.C. We saw this man, be impeached twice. We saw him commit 34 felonies and actually be convicted of those things, up to and including also the litany of things related to trying to steal the election in 2020, January 6th insurrection. Nothing that this man has done has stopped the Republican base from standing beside him. Nothing that he has done has quieted the MAGA crowds. Nothing that he has done has really reshaped or recast him as the villain he has happened to be throughout his entire career. And I think that we have come to the conclusion that nothing honestly will. Time and time again, we said, he's not above the law. He's not above the law. Then we saw the law shift to support him, with the Supreme Court basically giving him a kingdom. And I think that, unfortunately, that has become the call to arms, essentially, for those who want to see white supremacy rise, for those who essentially don't want to ever see a Trump presidency end, and for those who want to see an America that is essentially a dictatorship.
Again, I just love how she phrases this, that Donald Trump has had the sense of entitlement ever since he stepped into the public sphere, right? It's nothing new. I mean, he benefited again from this asymmetry when he was kind of this ridiculous curiosity in the 2015, 2016 election cycle. He was treated with kid gloves by the media. They gave him tons of coverage, not much by way of pushback, because he was almost like seen as a gadfly, like a troll, some sort of I don't know, something, a spectacle, not to be taken seriously. And then he wound up with the Republican nomination. And then by virtue of the Electoral College, which is affirmative action, politically speaking, for the Republican Party, he won the White House. And the media has still struggled to deal with him ever since. They fixate on too much, then too little, when the reality is he should be relentlessly fact-checked to the extent that they cover him at all. But again, that asymmetry is so frustrating, particularly in this moment, because no one is saying that you can't talk about the debate. No one is saying that you can't criticize President Biden's performance. As a matter of fact, no one's even saying that you can't call into question the competence of the candidates. The problem is, certainly right-wing media, but even mainstream media, grade Trump on a curve, which is wildly unacceptable. It's irrational. It's stupid. It's a terrible way. You can't evaluate two things, honestly, if you're comparing them and you hold them to different standards. The way you evaluate whether two things, be it two cars, be it two jobs, be it whatever it is, two things that you're choosing from, you have to hold them to the same standard by definition. If you don't do it, then any conclusion you draw is irrational and skewed. And Professor Alan Lichtman, an historian who has predicted, he would say 10 out of 10 of the previous presidential elections, he would argue that Vice President Gore had his victory stolen from him by a right-wing Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore in 2000. I'm inclined to agree, whatever. But certainly the 9 out of 10 elections he's predicted, he actually called out CNN for hyper fixating on Biden's debate performance days after the debate and ignoring all of the terrible, stupid, dishonest, dangerous things coming from Donald Trump.
And, I love you guys in the media, but I have to say you are complicit in Donald Trump lying and conning his way to the presidency. All the attention has been on Biden's faltering debate, but Donald Trump's debate was vastly worse. It was based entirely on lies, more than 30 significant lies. That's one lie for about every 1 minute and 20 and 30 seconds. He threatened our democracy by saying he wouldn't accept necessarily the results of a fair election. He said he would seek retribution. Why wasn't that the headlines? Why wasn't that the greatest concern from the debate, rather than all the focus on Joe Biden? There's an old saying, it's not just the evil people who wreak havoc on the world. It's the good people who don't do enough to stop them. And the media right now is complicit in Donald Trump gaslighting his way to the presidency and threatening our democracy.
It's very true. 100%. I mean, and I'll get into it kind of in my summation. And actually, as a matter of fact, I do want to show you this article from The Guardian. Why is the pundit class so desperate to push Biden out of the race? By Rebecca Solnit. I'm not usually one to offer diagnoses of people I've never met, but it does seem like the pundit class of the American media is suffering from severe memory loss because they're doing exactly what they did in the 2016 presidential race, providing wildly asymmetrical and inflammatory coverage of one candidate running against Donald Trump. They have become a stampeding herd, producing an avalanche of stories suggesting Biden is unfit, will lose, and should go away, at a point in the campaign in which replacing him would likely be somewhere between extremely difficult and utterly catastrophic. They do this while ignoring something every scholar and critic of journalism knows well, and every journalist should. As Nicole Hannah Jones puts it, quote, "As media, we consistently proclaim that we are just reporting the news, when in fact we are driving it. What we cover, how we cover it, determines often what Americans think is important and how they perceive these issues, yet we keep pretending it's not so." End quote. They are not reporting that he is a loser, they're making him one. According to one journalist tally, the New York Times has run 192 stories on the subject since the debate, including 50 editorials and 142 news stories. It's from the New York Times, folks. Remember the so-called liberal mainstream media? The Washington Post, which has also gone for saturation coverage, published a resignation speech they wrote for him. Not to be outdone, the New Yorker's editor-in-chief declared that Biden not going away, quote, would be an act not only of self-delusion, but of national endangerment, end quote, and had a staff writer suggest that Democrats should employ the 25th Amendment, which would remove President Biden from office. Okay. Speaking of coups, we've had a couple of late, which perhaps merit attention as we consider who is unfit to hold office. This time around, Trump is not just a celebrity with a lot of sexual assault allegations, bankruptcies, and loopily malicious statements as he was in 2016. He's now a convicted felon who orchestrated a coup attempt to steal an election through both backroom corruption and public lies and through a violent attack on Congress. The extremist U.S. Supreme Court justices he selected during his last presidential term themselves staged a coup this very Monday, overthrowing the U.S. Constitution itself and the principle that no one is above the law to make presidents into kings, just after legalizing bribery of officials and dismantling the regulatory state by throwing the Chevron deference out. Okay? Quote, why aren't we talking about Trump's fascism? Quote, demands the headline of Jeet Hears Peace in the Nation, to which the answer might be a piece by the nation's own editor-in-chief entitled, quote, Biden's Patriotic Duty, that proposes his duty is to get lost. Sometimes I wonder if all this coverage is because the media knows how to cover a normal problem like a subpar candidate, but they don't know how to cover something as abnormal and unprecedented as the end of the republic. So for the most part, they don't. The whole thing is a really good read. But the bottom line is this. This is a recurring thesis of this channel, identifying that there is objectively an asymmetry, obviously in right-wing media, which is inexcusable, but we expect it of them because they're ideologically bent towards backing the Republican candidate, particularly Trump. But even in the mainstream media, folks, and it's just an objective fact, Democrats are held to a higher standard. Republicans, including Trump, are graded on a curve. You have never seen anything like this in mainstream or right-wing media with respect to Trump, and certainly not for something so trivial as a 90-minute debate performance. Donald Trump, here's the thing. I see people, I think, and they're very well-intended when they try to argue, well, it's a question of Biden's mental fitness or cognitive decline versus Trump's criminality, when the reality is this. We have tons of evidence. We talked about it on this channel. We have so much evidence that we haven't been able to cover it all, and others have attempted to, that Donald Trump is mentally unfit. Donald Trump slurs his words. Donald Trump misspeaks. Donald Trump, goes on non sequiturs and, these random off-topic tangents. He does it all the time. He has enormous difficulty speaking extemporaneously, and he lies and he lies and he lies. Does Biden lie? Does Biden give falsehood? Yes, most politicians do, and it's fair to point it out. But Donald Trump is a class unto himself. There's an enormous, meaningful difference. It's almost like saying, well, this person is a shoplifter and another person's a mass murderer. They're both criminals, whatever. Well, actually, no. There are meaningful differences between two things, even if they have some degree of similarity. Donald Trump is objectively a greater and more prolific liar by far than Joe Biden. And so you take all these things into consideration. You take into into consideration, for example, that multiple former Trump officials have publicly stated that Donald Trump is an idiot, that Donald Trump is, quote, an effing moron, that Donald Trump is uncurious, he's ignorant, he would not read presidential briefs, he would not pay attention, he has a short attention span, he was tweeting instead, and that he's a buffoon. And these are coming from people who worked for him directly in cabinet and senior staff positions. And yet Republicans don't care. And so often, so many in the mainstream media don't care either. So even when it comes to the questions of mental fitness, you can ask the same questions about Donald Trump. And even after that debate, the poll showed that a majority of Americans think Donald Trump is mentally unfit to be president. So I still see no purpose, no point in ceding ground on this. The very thing that the media is calling out and questioning about President Biden, there's ample basis to call out and question about Donald Trump. And then a litany of things that's unique to Trump. The criminality, the fact that he's an adjudicated rapist, that he's an adjudicated fraudster, multiple felony convictions. The January 6th insurrection, the big lie, et cetera, and so forth. By any objective measure, Donald Trump is objectively worse and more controversial than Joe Biden, which means disproportionately focusing on Biden is irrational, especially when they've both been president and they're both competing for the same office. There's no way to spin this, folks. The media's disproportionate focus on Biden, given all the terrible things, and including recent things about Donald Trump, and, as the article in The Guardian points out, the Supreme Court decision, it's indefensible. And yet the mainstream media is gleefully throwing Biden and the Democrats under the bus for the sake of clicks and sensationalism, thus feeding into the Republican narrative and the right-wing media ecosystem. It's completely ridiculous, and I'm glad people are calling it out. You and I should as well. Let me know what you think in the comments.